Welcome to Chapter 38, the Musculoskeletal System. This is the first part in a four-part series on the skeletal system and the muscular system. The muscular and skeletal systems provide support to the body and allow for a wide range of movement. The bones of the skeletal system protect the body's internal organs and support the weight of the body. The muscles of the muscular system contract and pull on the bones, allowing for movements as diverse as standing, walking, running like the wind, and grasping items. So this chapter continues our study of animal systems by examining the skeletal and muscular systems. Because these systems work together so intimately to allow you to run like the wind, they are often studied together as the musculoskeletal system. So our objectives for this chapter: classify the different types of bones in the skeleton, explain the role of the human skeletal system, differentiate the axial and the appendicular skeletons, locate the bones of the skull on a diagram, classify the different types of muscle tissue, explain the role of muscles in locomotion, differentiate the two types of proteins found in skeletal muscle, describe the neuromuscular junction and explain its purpose, explain the process of muscle contraction, and explain the role of ATP in muscle contraction. Okay, so here we go. So we have already covered bone tissue as one of the primary tissue types when we talked about tissues in animal form and function. So this is just a quick review. This information you've already seen before. So bone is a connective tissue that forms the skeleton. Osteocytes are cells that make bone. That's the osteo part of osteocyte. And they hang out in these little spaces within compact bone called lacuna. Cortical bone, also known as compact bone, is the outer dense layer of bone that provides strength and an anchor for tendons and ligaments. Now, the osteon is the central canal in compact bone, also sometimes referred to as the Haversian canal, and it's the channel where blood vessels, artery and nerve, lymph vessels, and nerves travel through to provide nutrients and also innervation to bone. Within the osteon, we see these little tiny canals, we call them canaliculi, that travel away from the central canal. You can see them here as these sort of little lines going away from the Haversian canal, through which a little tiny nerve, a little tiny lymph vessel, and a little tiny artery and a little tiny vein travel through, again to provide nutrients and feeling and immunity to those layers of dense bone. Remember that bone is a living tissue. When you pick up a chicken bone after dinner at home, that is not living tissue. Or when you look at bones dug up in some archaeological dig, those are not living bones, but the bones in your body are very much alive, and that's why when you break a bone, it hurts, because those bones have nerves innervating them, and so that's why broken bones hurt. Okay, so lamella are these layers surrounding the central canal, because bone is built in layers from the central canal. So that's just a name for these layers, lamella. Now, cancellous, also known as spongy bone, is the inner layer of bone. We don't see it here because this is an example of compact bone. But it's spongy bone. We call it spongy bone because it looks like a sponge, otherwise known as cancellous, not cancerous. And it's spongy, thereby reducing the weight of the skeleton. So here we see the comparison. This is compact bone, virgin canal. You can see these little dark little spots. Those are your lacuna. And these little kind of scratch marks, look like little scratch marks going across, those are canaliculi. And of course you can see the layers, the lamella. Now this is spongy bone. This is a micrograph of real spongy bone, and you can see how porous it is. Porous because if all of your skeleton was made of dense compact bone, it would be very heavy and hard to carry around. Cancellous bone allows your bones, and especially your large bones like your femur, to be much lighter. And here we see just that. This is the trochanter of the femur. On the diagram on the left, you can see the layer of compact bone and then the layer of spongy bone where the joint is. There, your blood vessel coming up through there. Now here, and so this area down here, the shaft of the long bone is actually hollow. Well, it's not hollow, but it's filled with marrow, but without the marrow, it's just a hollow chamber. Now here is the same thing in real bone. You can see the compact bone here. This is cross section, really a longitudinal section, but cut through the bone. You can see the layer of compact bone that wraps completely around the bone, and then up here where the actual trochanter and the joint, the ball joint is, the ball part of the joint is, you can see the spongy bone. All right, so the skeleton is, your skeleton is divided into the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So the axial skeleton are all those bones associated with the central axis. If you draw an imaginary axis down through the top of your head, down through the middle of your body, down between your feet, you can spin around that axis, and that's the central axis. Okay, the axial skeleton consists of the skull, your vertebral column, and your thoracic cage. So your skull protects your brain, special senses like vision, hearing, taste, because your tongue is in there as well. It is broken into two parts, the cranium and the face, and it's a total of 22 bones. The cranium, by the way, is that part of your skull that protects your brain, and the face, of course, are those bones that make up the structure of your face. 22 bones total. The vertebral column protects the spinal cord. The spinal cord travels down through a hole in each of the vertebrae, and so that your spinal cord is completely wrapped in bone, encased in bone. The vertebral column supports the head. There are 24 vertebrae, and then there is a structure called the sacrum, and then a structure called the coccyx. So of your vertebrae, there are 7 cervical vertebrae. The first two, we call them C1 through C7. The first two, C1 is the atlas. I'll explain that in a minute. C2 is the axis. Those are the only vertebrae that have special names. I'll explain why shortly. There are 12 thoracic vertebrae. That's the vertebrae in the thorax, or the middle of the back, and there are 5 lumbar or lower back vertebrae. The vertebral column is often referred to as the backbone. The sacrum is down at the bottom. It's connected to the lumbar vertebrae. It's over time, it was 5 vertebrae, about 5 vertebrae, depending on the individual, but it really doesn't matter because they're all fused together into one structure that we call the sacrum. And then the coccyx, same thing, 3 or 4 or 5, depending on the individual, vertebrae that were fused together over developmental time and into one structure that we call the coccyx. And that's often referred to as the tailbone because it's the root of the tail of primates Of course, the tailbone in humans is a vestigial structure, but we still refer to it as the tailbone. The thoracic cage then are the ribs, the sternum, and the costal cartilages. Now the ribs are attached to the vertebrae in the back. They curve around to the front to protect vital organs, namely the heart and the lungs. There are 12 pair of ribs. 12 pair of ribs. And we want to be able to differentiate the true ribs from the false ribs and the floating ribs. We'll look at that in a minute. The sternum is also known as your breastbone. It's the attachment in the front, or the anterior part of the body. The ventral portion is the attachment for the costal cartilages, and the costal cartilages are just strips of cartilage, you know what cartilage is, that connect the ribs to the sternum. We'll look at the diagram in a second. Okay, let's talk about your skull. Skull is a bony structure that protects the brain, supports the structures of the face, consists of the cranium and the face, 22 bones total. So the cranium protects the brain. The brain sits in a cavity, in the cranial cavity, and the bones that directly lie over the brain are called the calvarium, often referred to as the skull cap. There are 8 cranial bones. They're connected by sutures. Now, a suture is an immovable joint. We'll look at a couple of sutures here in a minute. And so by name, the cranial bones are the frontal, parietal. There are 2 of them. Notice there's no number by frontal. Frontal is a single bone. There are 2 parietal bones. I'll point them out in a second. There are 2 temporal bones, 1 occipital bone, 1 sphenoid bone, and 1 ethmoid bone. Your mnemonic for cranial bones are friendly people of the southeast. That will make sense here in a second. Facial bones support and protect the special senses like vision, hearing, and taste, and they also support the dentition, which you know now as your teeth, and there are 14 facial bones. By name, they are the maxillae, or maxilla, there are 2, so we call them together the maxillae. Zygomatic bones, there are 2 of them. Palatal bones, there are 2 of them. Think of your hard palate in your mouth. That's a facial bone. Nasal bones, there are 2 of them. There's the vomer, there's only 1, and an inferior nasal concha, there's 2 of them. We call them paired bones where you have 2 of them, or for that matter, any structure, anatomic structure where there are 2 of them, like your kidneys. Your kidneys are a paired structure. Your lungs are a paired structure. Your inferior nasal concha are paired structures. Your mandible is a single bone, however. However, your lacrimal bone is a paired structure. There are 2 of them. And your mnemonic, mysterious zombies prowl the night, venturing into moonless light. Okay, let's go to the first video. This is a video I made a number of years ago, talking about the bones of the cranium. It's a little bit on the long side. It's about 19 minutes long. However, it describes all the cranial bones and how they fit together and how they function and all that together, and it has some neat animations in it. So check it out. Okay, diagrammatically, here are your cranial bones. Okay, so we have the frontal bone there. This is the bone of the forehead. You slap yourself in the forehead, you're slapping your frontal bone. There's only 1 of them. Here's your parietal bone. The parietal bones make up the top of your skull, the top of the cranium. There are 2 of them, 1 on the left side and 1 on the right side, and they're joined in the center by a sagittal suture. Okay, here is your occipital bone. That's a single bone. It sort of cups the back of your skull. If you put your hand at the back of your skull, like a little cup, that bone that is sitting there in the palm of your hand, that's the occipital bone. Temporal bone, this is the bone on the sides of the skull at the temples. Okay, that's where your temples get their name, from the temporal bone. There are two of them, one on each side. Sphenoid bone, you see part of it here, and if you're on the other side of the skull, you'll see the other part, but it's all connected as a single bone. It's shaped like a bat with outstretched wings. If you could look into the skull, you would see it at the floor, on the floor of the cranial cavity. It's shaped like a bat with outstretched wings, but we see the sides of it, or the ends of it, here on the outer part of the skull. So that's the sphenoid bone. And here's the ethmoid bone. You can just barely see it here, that little sort of brown color, orange-brown color. That's the ethmoid bone. It too is a single bone. And so you have 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's your 8 cranial bones. So frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, sphenoid, ethmoid. Friendly people of the southeast. Now, I'm from the southeast, and I think the people here are pretty friendly. So that's a pretty good mnemonic, friendly people of the southeast, to help you remember cranial bones. Oh yeah, there's your, we see a couple of facial bones here. I don't want to leave those out. There's your nasal bone, your lacrimal bone or lacrimal bone. There's the maxilla and your mandible, and there's your zygomatic bone or your cheekbone. All right, we'll check those out. Oh, there's a suture, another one, and another one there. This is your coronal suture. This is your lambdoidal suture, and there's your occipital suture back there. Okay, these are just immovable joints. Immovable because they fuse. There's the train again. Immovable because they fuse and develop. Now, in early development, as a fetus, these bones are not directly connected. But as you grow into adulthood, these bones fuse together, and we call those joints sutures. All right, the second video, again, one that I made concurrent with the bones of the cranium or the bones of the face. Check it out. So here we see diagrammatically facial bones. All right. So, okay, there is, I got these in blue dots now. So there is your nasal bone. It's a paired bone. You have two little bones right at the bridge of your nose where your glasses sit, one on either side of the midline. Those are your nasal bones. There are your zygomatic bones, one on each side. This is a paired bone, one here, one there, in this light blue color. Your cheekbone. So if you touch your cheek, the prominent part of your cheek, you're touching zygomatic bone. There is your maxilla, and there are actually two of them. They're fused together. There's a little suture line right there in the middle, right under your nose. But in development, the two maxillae fuse together, and so we call this, even though there's two bones are fused together, so we call this in dentistry we call this the maxilla. Okay, but anatomically there are actually two of them fused together. That's the maxilla. See, maxilla. There's your mandible. It's a single bone. It's your lower jaw bone, surrounds and supports the lower teeth. It's the only movable bone of the skull, by the way, not including the auditory ossicles, your inner ear bones. And there's your vomer. Okay, makes up part of the septum in the nose. That's your vomer. And we don't really see it here. The palatal bone, it's kind of showing a little smidge in there. The palatal bone, if you take your tongue and touch the roof of your mouth, you're touching palatal bone. There are two of them fused together at the palatal suture, but you have to look on the inside of the skull, not the inside of your mouth, because you can't see the actual bones in the suture, but you have to look on the inside of the skull to see those two bones sutured together at the palate. We call it the palatal suture. But palatal bone, that's a facial bone as well. And then there is your inferior nasal concha. Inferior because there's a superior nasal concha as well. But your facial bone, the inferior nasal concha is right there in green, and there you see it on the other side. So it is also a paired bone. All right? So your mnemonic is mysterious zombies prowl the night, venturing into moonless light. Maxilla, zygomatic, palatin, the night, nasal, venturing vomer into inferior nasal concha, moonless mandible, light, light, light. Lacrimal. Did I point out lacrimal before? I did not point out lacrimal, but there's lacrimal. That's light. So mysterious zombies prowl the night, venturing into moonless light. Maxilla, zygomatic, palatin, nasal, vomer, inferior nasal concha, mandible, lacrimal or lacrimal. Okay, quick check. Which of the following statements about the skull is true? Check all that apply, please. The cranium surrounds and protects the brain. The maxilla surrounds and supports the lower teeth. The zygomatic bones are facial bones. The sigmoid bone is a paired cranial bone. The auditory ossicles are located in the inner ear. The mandible is the only movable bone of the skull. We'll take them one at a time. So the cranium surrounds and protects the brain. Yes. Ever played the game, Cranium? Because it protects the brain. That's why the game is called Cranium. The maxilla surrounds and supports the lower teeth. Remember, maxilla is the upper jawbone, if you want to use that term, surrounds and supports the upper teeth. It's the mandible that surrounds and supports the lower teeth. So that's not true. The zygomatic bones are facial bones. Remember, zygomatic bones are your cheekbones. So yes, they are facial bones. The sigmoid bone is a paired cranial bone. Well, remember that the sigmoid is a cranial bone, right? That's the south part of the mnemonic, but it's not paired, it's a single bone, so that's not true. The auditory ossicles are located in the inner ear. We didn't talk about those, but those are the three little bones on the inner ear that help you hear sounds. Incus, malleus, and stapes, smallest bones in the whole body. Anyway, yes, located on the inner ear. And the mandible is the only movable bone of the skull, which is true, not including the auditory ossicles. The vertebral column. Vertebral column is a bony structure that surrounds and protects the spinal cord. As I've already mentioned, it supports the body, and it's an attachment for the ribs and the muscles of the back and the neck. There are 24 vertebrae, and they form a gentle S curve. and it is such that it is flexible. It allows your body to bounce to absorb shock. Now there are cervical vertebrae in the neck. There are 7 of them. We just identify them as C1 through C7, C being cervical. And the first 2, C1 and C2, are the only ones that have special names. C1 is the atlas. Show you that in a minute. And C2 is the axis, and I'll explain why in a second. There are your thoracic vertebrae, or in the middle of your back. In the thorax part of your body, we just label them T1 to T12. Your book uses TH1 to TH12. And you'll notice that we're numbering the vertebrae from the top to the bottom. So C1 is at the top, C7 is the last one in that strand from top to bottom of your C's, and then we start back with 1 with the T's, T1 through T12, and then we go to the lumbar. These are the vertebrae in your lower back, L1 through L5. Intervertebral discs are pads of fibrocartilage. You know what fibrocartilage is, separating the individual vertebrae. They are there. They're elastic. They are there because they absorb shock, like when you bounce or get shot out of the cannon. Remember that little scenario. Or like when you're running and you're bouncing. So along with the S curve, which is flexible, the intervertebral disc absorbs shock, as well as preventing bone-to-bone contact. And if you've ever had a degenerative disc, well, you guys haven't, but I have a degenerative disc. And lots of people, as you age, those discs tend to dry out, and sometimes they will completely fizzle out, completely disappear, and you will have bone-on-bone contact, and which I don't, thank goodness. But in cases like that, surgeons will go in and fuse the bones together, because when there's movement between 2 bones rubbing up against each other, and bones are alive, they have lots of nerves, it hurts. So often those bones will be fused together. Okay, your sacrum is a series of fused bones. Sacrum connects the vertebral column, C1 through L5, to the pelvic girdle, which is part of the lower limb, part of your appendicular skeleton. And then you have those little bones, little tiny vertebrae, 3 or 4, maybe 5, that are all fused together. We just refer to the one structure as the coccyx, or your tailbone. Or remember, that's a vestigial structure in humans. So here we see that gentle S curve, which allows the vertebral column, or your backbone, to be flexible. And we have C1, the atlas, C2 is the axis, and then C3 through C7, those are your cervical vertebrae. Your thoracic vertebrae here, TH or T1 through T12 in blue here. Your lumbar vertebrae in the lower back, L1 through L5. And you'll notice too, I hope that you would notice, that the vertebrae actually get larger as you go down. The L's have the largest, we call it the body of the vertebra, have the largest body. It makes sense because these vertebrae have to support everything above them. And then there's the sacrum, os sacrum here, referred to here in green, and the coccyx in purple. And so if we look at some details of the vertebrae, here is just one typical vertebrae. There's the vertebral foramen. Now that's where the spinal cord travels through. That's the opening, that's the hole where the spinal cord travels through. This is the body of the vertebrae and vertebra, and in blue you can see this represents the intervertebral disc, the cartilage disc. Likewise, we have these articular processes. That's where the vertebra on top of this vertebra articulates. Articulates just means comes together. And there's a little pad of cartilage there as well. Again, you don't want bone rubbing on bone. This is a spinous process. It says bifid because in some vertebrae, the spinous process that sticks out is forked, and in others it's not. If it's forked, it's called bifid. And this is the spinous process is the part when you, if you look at someone's back, you can see those little bumps representing the backbone. Those are the spinous processes of individual vertebrae that you're seeing. And in the thoracic vertebrae, actually, if someone is thin enough, you can actually count the 12 vertebrae in the thorax. The transverse foramina, one here, one there, are where spinal nerves travel through. But what I really want you to remember here are the body, which gets bigger as you go south, the vertebral foramina, where the spinal cord travels through, okay? So if we look at several together, we can also see the intervertebral disc here and here. You can see the spinous processes here. The spinal cord travels down through the vertebral foramen. And so this is on the interior of the body. This is towards the exterior, towards the dorsum. So again, if someone is actually, these are the bumps on your back that when you sort of bend over, somebody, you can see them in a mirror, or somebody can see them, can feel them. Those are the spinous processes on the dorsal side of the vertebral column. And oh yeah, here you can see some spinal nerves coming out through those transverse foramina. Now, C1 and C2, we give them special names. C1 is called atlas, C2 is called the axis, because C1, these processes here, that's where your skull articulates with the first cervical vertebra. Your skull articulates right here. And in C2, it's called the axis because it has this little divot up here. It's called the dens, and it fits right up here into the atlas, and that is the rotation. It's the point of rotation. That is what allows you to turn your head from left to right and back and forth. Okay. Now this is called atlas because it holds up the skull. And the reason they use atlas, because you've seen various images like this. This is from Greek mythology. This is Atlas holding up the world. And so the atlas, C1, holds up your skull like the mythical Atlas holds up the world. That's where that comes from. And so here you see it in diagram. Now here is the real thing. This is dried bone, of course, where you see atlas here on top, and there's the axis, C2, and there's the dens popping up through. And so everything above C1 and the skull, everything there pivots around the dens of C2. Ta-da! Thoracic cage, also known as your rib cage. It's the skeleton of the chest. Consists of the ribs, the sternum, thoracic vertebrae, and the costal cartilages. Now, the thoracic cage encloses and protects the organs of the thoracic cavity, namely the heart and the lungs. And it provides support for the shoulder girdles and the upper limbs, which we'll look at. Now, the attachment, the thoracic cage is also an attachment point for the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the muscle that allows you to breathe. It allows for the inflation and deflation of the lungs. Smooth muscle, remember. The thoracic cage also is a detachment point for the muscles of the back, chest, neck, and shoulders. Changes in volume of the thorax or the thoracic cage enable breathing that comes from the diaphragm as it contracts and relaxes. All right, the sternum, also known as your breastbone, is in the ventral part or the anterior part of the thoracic cage. It's a long, not incredibly long, it's maybe 8 inches long. It's a flat bone. It's actually a bone, a single bone that is a fusion of 3 bones, and manubrium at the top if you want to know, but you don't have to know. Manubrium at the top, the body in the middle, and the xiphoid process down at the bottom. So if you take your finger, go down to the bottom of your breastbone, and you feel that little point, that's the xiphoid process. That is also a landmark when you're doing CPR, if you know CPR. The sternum is located at the anterior chest or on the ventral surface of your body, and it's an attachment for the costal cartilages, which we'll talk about in a minute. Your ribs are curved bones. They are attached in the back on the dorsal surface to the thoracic vertebrae, and they curve anteriorly to form the rib cage. Now, there are 12 pairs of ribs. There are 7 pairs of true ribs. We call them true ribs because they're connected by cartilage to the sternum. Ribs 8 through 12 are called false ribs because they are attached to, 8 through 10 are attached to cartilage, which then is attached to cartilage, which then is attached to the sternum. So these false ribs, they're called false ribs because they're not attached directly to bone. And then floating ribs, or ribs 11 and 12, are floating because they are not attached to cartilage at all. This will make sense when I show you the picture. And your costal cartilages then are those strips of cartilage that connect the ribs to the sternum, except for ribs 11 and 12, which are floating ribs. That all makes sense? All right, so here we see our thoracic cage, and numbering from top to bottom, those are your true ribs, 1 through 7. As you can see, they are connected directly to the sternum via the costal cartilages. Of 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, those are your false ribs, because with regard to 8 and 9, they're connected to cartilage, which then is connected to the cartilage of number 7, which then is connected to the sternum. So they are false ribs in the fact that they're not connected directly to bone, but their cartilages are connected to cartilage. And with regard to 11 and 12, they're not connected to cartilage at all. And so we refer to those as your floating ribs. The video will explain it better. Okay, structure of the rib cage. This is by What's Up Dude. It's only about 1.5 minutes long, but it's full of information talking about the rib cage. And time for a quick check. So which of the following statements about the axial skeleton is false? Check all that apply. There are 7 cervical vertebrae in the lower back. Human males have 24 ribs, while human females have 23. Sternum is also known as the breastbone. Costal cartilages attach ribs 1 through 7 to the sternum. The thoracic cage protects the heart and lungs. The ribs are attached posteriorly to vertebrae. Let's look at these individually. Let's look at these one at a time. So there are 7 cervical vertebrae. That is true. There are 7 cervical vertebrae, C1 through C7, in the lower back. But C1, cervical means neck. So the cervical vertebrae are not in the lower back. So that's definitely false. Human males have 24 ribs while human females have 23. Where does that even come from? Well, if you know the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible, I'm not getting religious on you here, but it's an interesting story. If you believe that that the female was that God took one rib of Adam and made Eve, and so that would make that brings up the idea that females have 23 ribs, males have 24. But that would definitely not be false, even if you believe the story, because in that case, only Eve would have 23 ribs, right? Every female after Eve would have 24 ribs. So that's definitely not true. And I'll just throw that out there as just a point of humor, okay? The sternum is also known as the breastbone. That's true, right? Sternum. Costal cartilages attach ribs 1 through 7 to the sternum. Remember, ribs 1 through 7 are true ribs, so they are attached by cartilage directly to the sternum. So that's true. The thoracic cage, rib cage, protects the heart and the lungs. That is true. And the ribs are attached posteriorly, dorsally in the back to vertebrae, and that is definitely true. Preguntas? Any questions? That will be the end of, or this will be the end of chapter 38, part 1. See you for the next one.